I knew I didn't feel good, but I was trying to kind of toughen up and thought maybe I was just being dramatic. Even my husband was like, the doctors are saying you're fine, but, you can't get out of bed and you're struggling to keep up with our family. We love to hike, we love to go for walks and do things together. So things were just hard, and couldn't put a title on what I was feeling. I think it was really just affecting our marriage. It was affecting my relationship with my son. At that point, the bills were stacking up. I had had multiple CT scans, multiple x-rays at that point, and they hadn't found anything. And the day that I went to the ER, I was actually by myself. At that point, it was my ribs that were hurting a lot. I had coughed and thought that I broke a rib. The ER doctor was like, okay, you probably just bruised something. I don't think you have actually a broken rib. And I remember when he came back after I went and did the x-ray, he was kind of like the look of shock on his face. And he was like, I hate to have to tell you this, but we're seeing evidence of metastatic disease. So we did the biopsy a week later. I was home alone, got the phone call. It was a very quick, kind of cold phone call, it felt like. The person just said, hi, this is so-and-so from the cancer center, calling to let you know that the results of your biopsy show that you have stage 4 lung cancer. I thought that I had weeks to live. My name is Loryn. I live in Massachusetts, and I was diagnosed with stage 4 non-small cell lung cancer with a HER2 mutation in November of 2024. My first symptoms that I can point to and say that was definitely the cancer was I started experiencing them probably in about maybe June of 2024, and it was extreme fatigue and back pain. So I kind of just attributed it to, working too hard, not sleeping right. I have a 3.5-year-old, although at the time he was 2. So, I just thought, oh, every parent is this tired, and I probably just pulled a muscle picking him up. And it wasn't until the pain started getting worse and I was having almost chest pain with it, that I decided to go to the ER and be seen for it. And, at the time, all they saw was some small nodules, nothing big or concerning. So they just diagnosed me with pneumonia and prescribed me antibiotics and sent me on my way. So 2 weeks later, the pneumonia still hadn't resolved. And I went back to the ER, and it was at that point that they said, okay, it still looks like pneumonia, but the fact that it hasn't resolved is concerning, so you should go see a pulmonologist. And, the pulmonologist kind of felt the same way, that it wasn't anything concerning. I didn't have any risk factors or anything to say you definitely need to have an endoscopy or something right now. So they kind of continued on that, what could be causing pneumonia like this. So they thought maybe an autoimmune disease, or something viral maybe. So I then was sent to a rheumatologist, and it was while I was waiting for that appointment that I started experiencing joint pain pretty much all over my body. It was my feet, my legs, my hips, my shoulders and elbow. And it was at that point I went back to the ER after calling my doctor, and that's when they saw that my cancer had metastasized to my bones. I think both my doctors and I, really didn't think the symptoms I was experiencing were serious enough to warrant doing more. And I tend to be kind of an optimist. So I think that, definitely worked against me, and that maybe I didn't take myself seriously enough. I tend to be kind of like I'm fine, I'm okay, I can work through it kind of person. So, I think maybe I didn't advocate for myself as strongly as I could have or should have. But I think my doctors as well, they only saw the small nodules. They were all smaller than, 2 millimeters at the time. And they kind of described them as ground glass nodules. So, I think they were definitely, had some bias as well, that I was a non-smoker, that I didn't have any other risk factors. The first meeting with that pulmonologist that I had, he ran through so many different questions about my work history, about where I grew up, if I had a wood stove at home, so I think he was really trying to find a reason to, do a biopsy, but there was just nothing at all that he could point to. It was, I think, 4 months from my first ER visit to the last one where I was diagnosed. The day that I went to the ER and they kind of gave me that news, I was actually by myself. And the ER doctor was like, okay, you probably just bruised something. I don't think you have actually a broken rib. And I remember when he came back after I went and did the x-ray, he was kind of like the look of shock on his face. And he was like, I hate to have to tell you this, but we're seeing evidence of metastatic disease on your x-ray. We can see it in your ribs, your shoulder, and your liver. Well, they had transferred me to a larger city, a larger hospital. And they kept me in the hospital for a week to do a biopsy of one of the lesions that they saw. So we did the biopsy a week later, and I was called with the news 2 days after that. And again, I was home alone. We knew the news was coming, but we weren't really sure how it was going to come. So I was home alone, got the phone call. And it was a very quick, kind of cold phone call, it felt like, where the person just said, hi, this is so-and-so from the cancer center, calling to let you know that the results of your biopsy show that you have stage 4 lung cancer. So it was pretty shocking. At that point, I just had like a full emotional reaction to what I was going through. I called my husband and told him to come home because in my mind, stage 4 lung cancer, I thought that I had weeks to live. I thought I was going to end up on oxygen. The picture of lung cancer that I had was a very very basic one. I had never known anyone with lung cancer. So I just kind of knew what I knew from TV, I guess, and thought that I'm going to deteriorate really quickly. So my reaction was pretty, it was pretty devastating news to get because I just didn't have that knowledge of what lung cancer was. While I was at the hospital, they talked about the biopsy, why they were doing the biopsy, that they could, tell. They did the biopsy from my liver. And they said that from that, they could tell where the cancer had originated from to be able to properly stage it and diagnose. But they never mentioned any gene testing. It wasn't until that phone call that I received and I called my husband to come home right away. I was just in such an emotional state that I really couldn't do anything. So my husband called the surgeon that did my biopsy to get more information. When they had originally called me, I tried to ask questions and they told me I would have to wait 2 weeks to see an oncologist to be able to ask any additional questions. So I kind of just shut down at that point. But my husband was like, no, we need some answers. We can't just sit here for 2 weeks with no information. So, I know now that they didn't want to do anything for 2 weeks because they were probably waiting for the results of the gene testing. But I didn't know that. They didn't mention that to me. So when my husband called the surgeon, he brought up that that they already sent the sample out for gene testing. He sent my husband a PDF of you have lung cancer, now what, kind of information. And that PDF kind of went through, what the biomarker testing was, what some potential biomarkers could be, and what the next steps could be from there. So I did read through that before I heard anything further. But it didn't really go into too much detail about HER2, which was what I ended up being diagnosed with. There was one quick mention of HER2, and the information was in the section that was kind of now what do you do, was oh, there aren't any targeted treatments for HER2, so you'll be on traditional chemo, and that was really it. So it was at that point that we just felt like we weren't getting the attention that we felt like we needed. We weren't getting answers to our questions. We were just given, a PDF, and, that was really all the information that we had. And that's when we decided to seek a second opinion at another hospital. The first meeting that I had with my oncologist, she talked really in depth about the biomarker testing. We didn't know that I had HER2 yet. She opted to do a liquid biopsy at that point because we were still waiting on the tissue biopsy. And she wanted to try to get the ball moving as quick as possible after she looked at my scans and kind of saw how advanced everything was. Um, she did let me know that the liquid test isn't always as accurate as a tissue test. So if the liquid test came back with nothing, that we would wait for the tissue biopsy results. But luckily, the liquid test did come back with the HER2 mutation. So we had another meeting the next day after those results came back, where she kind of went through HER2, what that meant. She was very honest that the field of HER2 right now, that there aren't as many options, but that there's many clinical trials available, and that she was going to make sure that I had access to, as much research and science as she could provide to me. So, at that point, we moved very quickly into the treatment stage, but she answered all of the questions that I had about HER2 and what that meant. I had done a little bit of research about biomarkers, and had kind of hoped that I had one that was a little more prominent, but so I didn't know as much about HER2. But I felt really, really comfortable with her answers. She even let me know that she was part of a research project that was happening on HER2, which was really encouraging too. So it definitely made me feel a lot better about having HER2, but it was kind of shocking, when I first, heard that was what I was going to be dealing with. I made the mistake of Googling her too, which looking back, I wish I hadn't done that. The information that is out there about HER2 is pretty dated. And the first thing that Google told me is that, it's super rare, that the prognosis isn't as great for HER2 because there aren't as many options, and that it tends to be like a more aggressive mutation. So those are the first things that I was reading, and was just really disappointed. Again, really scared. I still didn't know as much about lung cancer. I was trying to learn as fast as I could, but still kind of had that mindset of like, you know, I don't have much time left. And now I've got this mutation that's super rare and super aggressive. And it just felt like everything was kind of stacking against me, and that there was just no good news coming in. Everything that we were hearing was just negative. But, I trusted what my oncologist was telling me. She told me, don't Google anything, but it was already too late. So it was definitely a scary time, like looking back to those first couple of weeks from diagnosis until I started treatment. It was just pretty depressing. I was kind of holding some of the information from like extended family. I didn't want them to know, how dire things felt. Um, but everyone was kind of feeling it, not knowing what was going to happen. The first treatment, it did feel like that was the only option. She did let me know that in order to be eligible for, other clinical trials or other options that I had to do this this chemo set first. That it's the first line option, and was my best option. I'm sure if I pushed a little bit, maybe there could have been something there, but it was definitely presented in a way that like this is the option. And then once this fails, we can talk what next steps are, and that things kind of open up a little bit more for you. So I was put on just a traditional chemo. And again, she was very honest about it, that she wasn't expecting it to last for very long. That, optimistically, maybe I would get 6 months on that treatment line. So I was kind of trying to mentally prepare for that a little bit. And trying to explain it to my family too. I think a lot of people think, once you start treatment, a lot of people ask, well, how long are you going to be on this treatment for until, you could stop? They kind of look for that like end goal. And, for me, it was just like a necessary evil to get to something better. So trying to explain that to family was a little tricky. But we were able to start it pretty quickly. I think I started on December 5th. So it was just about a month after my initial ER visit, once treatment started. So they moved really, really quickly. I've seen, patients who are not offered any biomarker testing, that they're just put right on chemotherapy. So it's certainly happening in other places. And, I wish more people knew about how important biomarker testing is to knowing what your treatment options are, and to having like the full view of what the future might hold for the specific cancer that you have. Um, Even just Googling some of the cancer types, biomarker testing doesn't come right up most of the time, at least in my initial days of Googling. I try not to Google anymore, so maybe it's getting better, but it certainly didn't come up in my initial research. But I think some of the larger hospitals are really starting to push that information. And, I think people are getting better about getting second opinions too, which is great. I think that it's part of your right as a patient to get a second opinion. And if you don't feel that what you're hearing is helpful, pushing for that second opinion, I think is really important too. So I started my targeted therapy in March of this year. So it's been about 4 months now. And my therapy is done through an infusion every 3 weeks. So I know a lot of targeted therapies are starting to come out in pill form that you take every day, which is really amazing. And I'm kind of excited for that, hopefully to become a more standard option for her too in the future. But for right now, being on that infusion every 3 weeks, I've learned to manage it. The first week after the infusion is a little rough, with fatigue and nausea. I get some kind of body aches, in particular in the places where I know my lesions are. Um, but from when I started that first treatment, I've gotten so much better. My quality of life has improved so much in between my infusions. I feel more like my old self, and my old self before any of my symptoms had started. Um, it's, my bone pain that I was having has gone away. The liver pain that I was having has gotten a lot better. My blood work has gotten so much better. For a long time, my liver enzymes were really, really elevated. They were really worried about, my liver function, but that's improved. So I can kind of just live my life normally for 2 weeks, and then I go back for my infusion. So we kind of just plan our lives around that 1 week that I'm not feeling well. We get childcare, and we still have friends and family that reach out to help us out as much as they can. Um, I kind of just plan to hibernate for a week, it feels like, and then I'm just back to my old self, which is really great. So I'm really, really grateful for this treatment option that I'm on, and hopefully I get to be on it for as long as I can. My oncologist is hoping that I get a year on this treatment. And has kind of prepared for, what that next step after this one would be. But hopefully, fingers crossed, I can be on it for at least that year. If I dwell on it too long, it does kind of get to me that, typical 30 something year olds are, planning their lives, they're building their families, they're, have these professional goals or physical goals that they're trying to attain, where my goals are kind of just getting through the day sometimes. And they're more short-term goals. I try to still set myself, things to look forward to, vacations and, hobbies that I have, but it's certainly not what it used to be from 5 years ago when I was, kind of climbing the career ladder and, feeling good. My husband and I were hiking all the time, and things have just changed so drastically from who I was 5 years ago. Um, but for me, the perspective that cancer has given me, has been to just kind of enjoy the day-to-day things, that I have the privilege of having. For a period of time there, I wasn't sure that I was going to have those things anymore. I was barely walking when I was first diagnosed. I had so much pain in my hip and my leg. I thought I was going to be in a wheelchair, if I even made it that long. So, I just feel grateful for all of the kind of mundane things that I get to have. But it can be challenging now being in, circles with parents of small children, and they're kind of making these big plans for their kids' future. And, if they're going to play soccer, if they're going to be, a theater kid or something like that. And I'm just hoping to make it to that point, to see my son get to do those things. And I certainly don't have some of the, kind of complaints that parents have. I might have them deep down, the stressful days and the temper tantrums, but, I try to just be grateful for those things instead of being brought down by those things. So, it's weird to say that, but I am grateful to the illness that I've been diagnosed with for giving me that perspective. I think for a period of time there before I was diagnosed, things were just hard, and I didn't have a title to put on the pain that I was feeling. It My husband and I think, struggled together because of those things, because I didn't have energy, because I was always going to the doctor, and couldn't put a title on what I was feeling. I think it was really just affecting our marriage. It was affecting my relationship with my son. It was affecting my working relationships. So finally getting to colic cancer and start treating it just opened everything up for me and has changed my attitude. It's changed me mentally. So it's, again, just really weird to say that you're grateful for cancer, but I try not to dwell on the hard parts of it and the disappointing parts that it took so long to get diagnosed. And I try to just be grateful that now I can move forward, and hopefully research keeps up with me so that I can keep living the life that I have. To advocate for yourself, I've become, I don't want to say like a squeaky wheel, but if I'm feeling any kind of pain or extreme nausea, I immediately bring it up to my doctors. Where a year ago I was suffering and in so much pain, so tired, and just afraid to bring those things up and to be seen as like being a baby or being a wimp and not being able to deal with the symptoms that I was dealing with. I can pretty safely say that I'm not that way anymore, that if anything is getting in my way of being happy and being healthy, that I bring it up with my care team, and they're always just more than happy to help me and to adjust my drugs that I'm on, or offer me other treatment options and things like that. So, I think just being honest about how you're feeling and how it's affecting you, the things that you can and can't do. You really just, in our medical system, it's just not built in a way that people are going to check in with you. You have to check in with them. So that would be my piece of advice for someone going through a diagnosis.